Now, from CBS 4 News, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede, and today we begin with congressional redistricting. In 2010, Florida voters overwhelmingly approved a constitutional amendment known as Fair Districts that sought to take politics out of the process, or at least try to, and make sure maps are drawn fairly and that minorities are not disadvantaged. Because let's remember, after the Civil War, it was 115 years before an African American was elected to Congress from this state. The Florida House and Senate both drew new congressional maps this year that complied with the Florida Constitution and did not deliberately target black districts. But Governor Ron DeSantis came up with his own map, and when the legislature refused to pass his map, he recently vetoed their plans and is demanding legislators come back to Tallahassee in a few weeks and approve his map. This week, I spoke to Ellen Freidin, the head of Fair Districts Now. She led the campaign in 2010 to pass the constitutional amendment the governor is now trying to sidestep.
The governor essentially bulldozed himself into a governmental process that he has no official role in. And he did that apparently in order to please the national party bosses who are demanding that Florida come up somehow with more Republican representatives in Congress. And so on the eve of Martin Luther King Day, he presented a map to the legislature. This is unprecedented. Never before in history that anybody can remember has there been a governor who inserted himself into the process in the way that this governor has done. He filed a map that actually does create many more Republican seats in Congress. But in the process of doing that, and in his national political ambition, what he's doing is he is essentially erasing Black access districts. And that is totally unacceptable and totally contrary to the Fair Districts amendments that are in the Florida Constitution.
What would the net effect of the governor's map be in terms of who would be representing Florida going forward?
Well, the net effect, from what I understand, would be that there would be, instead of, Florida is a 50-50 state in terms of Democrats and Republicans. And what the governor's map does is it rigs districts so that we have 28 members of Congress starting in 2022. And the governor's map would create a situation where it's not a 14-14 map. It would be a 20 Republican and 8 Democratic representatives in Congress. And this is being done in order to favor the Republican Party and to curry favor with Republicans all over the country, which is what he's up to doing because he's apparently looking to run for president. He's doing that on the backs of minority voters in Florida.
Particularly African-American voters, congressional districts in the North End, currently represented by Al Lawson, and potentially the seat currently occupied, although she's giving it up, by Val Demings. Those are the two districts that you're most looking at in terms of concern as to how they're being redrawn. Is that fair?
Yes.
So let's take a step back for a second. You first got involved in this as the chairperson for the campaign for Fair Districts. The governor's map seems to be a direct assault on what the voters of Florida overwhelmingly passed almost a decade ago, which was Fair Districts. So explain what Fair Districts was and what currently the law says, because Fair Districts did pass and go into the state constitution.
In 2010, 63% of the voters said that they wanted to have in the Florida Constitution hard, strict rules to stop legislators from rigging districts for their own political advantage and to favor their party. They also had the benefit of protecting minority voters so that where minorities had representation, that representation couldn't be intentionally diminished. That's what the Fair Districts Amendments are about. They are to create fairly drawn districts where voters' votes matter, as opposed to districts that had been being rigged for decades, probably centuries, for purposes that were purely political.
Now, the governor argument is, and he's got a lot of, attorneys behind him in terms of conservative attorneys who say that essentially that process, particularly the phrase you use, diminishing, in other words, to not diminish the representation of minority access seats, flies in the face and violates the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. He's actually making the case that by protecting minority voting rights in those districts and minority representation, it violates the 14th Amendment. What's your response?
He is taking that position, and my response is that that's just not something that I think most Floridians would agree with. The Florida citizens took the initiative and told the legislature how they wanted them to draw districts, and that was fairly and not for purposes of political gain. And what the governor's position, if the governor's position would be upheld, essentially what it does is it gives free rein to those in Tallahassee who are supposed to be representing us to just do whatever they want without any control by the citizens. The legislators need to remember that they're working for the people of Florida. We should be their boss. And we made it very clear in 2010 that we want the legislature to follow the rules in terms of redistricting. Now, I will say that the legislature did start out this legislative session following the rules. And it appeared that they were very concerned about following the rules. And they consistently talked about how they were following the rules. And in fact, they passed a state Senate map and a state House map that were really compliant with the rules. But then the governor stepped in. And when the governor stepped in, he started bullying the legislature and threatening vetoes and threatening, who knows what else he was threatening. But he made it very clear publicly that he wasn't going along with this business of following the rules. He wanted them to deviate from the rules. So now we're coming into a special session. We want the legislature to do everything in its power to stand up and against the governor and follow the Fair Districts Amendments.
So looking ahead, either the legislature is going to acquiesce and accept the governor's map, or they're going to stand firm and say, no, we passed a map that we believe meets constitutional muster and follows the rules under fair districts, and keep that going forward. Depending on the outcome, doesn't all of this ultimately probably just end up in the courts to decide?
Well, I think it's likely to end up in the courts because, as has been indicated, if the legislature and Governor DeSantis come to an agreement on a map that doesn't follow the Florida Constitution, I am relatively certain that that's going to end up in the courts. On the other hand, Governor DeSantis has said that if the legislature doesn't bow to his will, that will end up in the courts. So I think there's going to be court involvement one way or another.
When we come back, we will hear from a man whose sister died in Surfside and is angry the legislature did nothing to make condos safer. Stay with us.